Okay, back in the garage here, we got the nice mini bike up on the lift. The sun's kind of getting in the way over there. It only took one trail ride to confirm my suspicions, which was that this system sucks. It's got no low end torque whatsoever. It's got mid speed and high speed, and that's it. At low speed, when you try to give it gas under heavy load, it just clunks and jerks and doesn't really move all that much. So we're going to remedy that by replacing this with a torque converter. I'm also going to do a new chain in the back here because this chain is pretty badly worn out. The sprocket's still in good shape, but the chain is just shot. And it wasn't until I got up on this bench that I actually noticed this. This is the master link. It looks newer than the rest of the chain. If you look closely, you might notice something's missing. There's no clip on it. This is staying in through sheer luck. And then if you look here, the roller is completely shot. So that's another nice little surprise from the previous owner, but oh well, it stayed together. We had a tow rope in case it came apart, but that's all going to get replaced. So I'm probably not going to film this particular one that much because I still haven't figured out exactly what I have to do to get the torque converter in, but we'll go into more detail on the next one when I know what I need to do to make this work. Goodbye, clutch. You will not be missed. Farewell, jackshaft. So the torque converter normally will bolt on right about there, but it's hitting the frame, so it won't seat all the way. Now I know a lot of people will put spacers on the engine and raise the engine up. The problem is they usually raise it up about an inch. I don't know if an inch is going to give me the clearance I need. Also, I don't think that we necessarily have an inch of clearance between the exhaust, the air filter housing, and this frame. And if we raise the engine up an inch with this tank on here, I'm not going to be able to get the gas cap off to put fuel in it. And we can't really clock it up anymore because then, well, the shaft housing itself starts hitting the engine. So I'm going to work on this for a while and figure something out. I know I said I didn't want to lift the engine, but I ended up lifting the engine. Now, I looked at it for a while and I realized that my options were to either hack up the torque converter backing plate or lift the engine up. And I decided that I would rather lift the engine up. So I made some spacers out of some 1-inch square tube that lifts it up about an inch. Now that gave me most of the clearance I needed. However, I did need to trim just a little bit off. You can see this is how much I took off from the bottom of the torque converter backing plate, but that's a whole lot better than having to cut it like all the way up here, because if I hadn't lifted the engine I would have to cut all the way up here, back here a bit, and then probably waller out these holes where it mounts the engine as well, and I really didn't want to do all that. The other thing is that with it lifted up, now I don't have to worry about the chain hitting the frame. I know it looks close right now, but it's loose. So if I tighten it up, you see plenty of clearance, and I do kind of want to add an automatic tensioner, which will run on the bottom here, give us even more clearance. But if you look up here, you can see the reason why I didn't want to lift the engine. So this is the shield for the muffler, and you can see the seat is resting pretty much right on top of it. And once I started messing with this, I realized why it was so rattly. This shield is missing the bolts on the top, and the mounts on the side have ripped right out of the side of the muffler, so I don't know how much this muffler is actually muffling at this point. But you can see it's hitting, the shield is hitting right here. The muffler clears, but the shield is hitting. And I also lengthened the slots in the engine mount plate so I could get the engine as forward as possible to clear these bars. And you can see we just barely have enough clearance so that I can get the air filter cover off so I can change the air filter. But we'll have to do something about this exhaust. It's way too close to the seat, plus the muffler is kind of shot, so I'll have to figure something out with that. And you can see at the front here we have issues with the tank as well. It's actually resting on the tank right now. We'll move over here. It's resting on top of the actual gas tank right now, but of course the front mounts are broken. I think it normally sits right about there when the front mounts aren't broken, and you can see there's pretty much no clearance for the gas cap. So I think what I'm going to do about this is simply raise up the fake fuel tank. I'm going to have to re-weld those mounts anyway, so I'll just bend them so that the tank sits up a little bit higher, just high enough to get the gas cap off so it can be filled with fuel, and then that should be good. So now I just need to finish this up and get this get the final pieces all together. Torque converter is all installed, got the cover on, new chain. It's a bit dirty from the install, but I'll clean that later. I did try to tighten it up a bit, but unfortunately there's still a fair bit of slack in it, so I might need to take a link out later. Still need to raise up the gas tank and do something with the exhaust, and once that is done, I can take it for a test ride. So I ended up bringing the back of the tank up probably about a ½ inch or so. You can see we've got a little bit tighter clearance between the seat and the fuel tank, or the fake fuel tank I should say, but most of the difference is coming from the front. The front is a good couple inches higher than it was before, which is what's giving me most of the clearance for the gas cap. I know it doesn't look like much, but remember this fake tank was pretty much resting on the gas cap before. Luckily it's a low profile gas cap, doesn't take up a lot of space, so we have plenty of space to get the gas cap off. And then because the filler on the tank is offset, I should be able to get the fuel nozzle in there to fill it up just fine. So that should work nicely. So this is what I ended up doing with the exhaust. It's the stock muffler, but it's sitting 90 degrees on its side. The way I did this is I just cut it off at the muffler and at the flange, rotated the pipe 180 degrees and welded it back together. So now instead of sitting above the engine, the muffler sits out to the side of the engine, and then there's a little diverter on the heat shield. Normally that would divert the exhaust down, but since it's on its side, it would have been diverting the exhaust back in towards the engine, so I just chopped that off. So now the exhaust just shoots straight out the back. And by putting it here, this gives me plenty of clearance so that it doesn't, set the seat on fire, which is always good. By keeping the stock muffler, I also don't have to worry about doing anything with the jetting for now. I don't know that I'm going to leave it this way, but I needed something just to get me by for the time being that wouldn't set the seat on fire and wouldn't force me to rejet. And surprisingly enough, it actually doesn't hit my leg, so that's a bonus. So with the exhaust installed, I think we're about done with this one, at least for now. Alright, so we got the nice one out of the way. Now it's time for the fun one, the sketchy one. This is going to be a little bit easier in one aspect and a lot harder in every other aspect. The easy part is the fuel system. Now obviously we're missing the fake gas tank, and we've just got this one jerry-rigged in here because the original leaked. So we won't have to worry about the real gas tank interfering with the fake gas tank at all. Everything else is going to be harder though. This engine, there's some frame issues with this mini bike, and the engine's not sitting where it's supposed to be. Now if you recall the first video I did on these, I found that the valve cover was actually smashing into this bar here, and you can see there's just a little gap. I was able to get the engine move forward just enough so that it wouldn't be hitting that bar. But it's still sitting too far back, and these the muffler and the air filter box are not in the right spot in relation to these bars. It should be forward enough so that I can lift this air filter up straight without hitting this bar, and you can see the bar is right over top of the air filter. So the engine's still sitting too far back. Now, I had a few theories as to what was going on, but it wasn't until I just got it pressure washed just now that I can actually see what's going on. Now, I knew that this had been booger welded, but I wasn't sure as to the extent of the damage or why it had been done that way. But now that it's clean, you can see where the paint has burned off from the heat of the welding, and they've welded it on both sides. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's actually cracks, multiple cracks around these mounting bolts. And this actually might explain why this mini bike just wants to vibrate every time you hold it wide open. When I went on that test ride, I never held it wide open for any extended period of time because it would just start vibrating. I think those cracks might have something to do with it. But the other thing is that, again, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but all the metal around those bolt holes has been yanked upwards. So the end result is that the front of the engine is sitting higher than the back of the engine, and that's causing this valve cover to sit too far towards this bar, and it's making the muffler and the air filter sit back too far as well. Now, how did that happen exactly? Well, I have a theory. Recall that the bearing was completely shot on this mini bike. It was just flopping around all over the place, and the chain was ungodly tight. What I think happened is the bearing failed, and because of that, the wheel was allowed to flop around. So what was happening is it would move around and it would basically yank the chain, which was yanking on the engine. That caused it to yank the engine over time. It caused it to slowly yank the engine back as far as it could in the adjustment, and created stress upwards on the front, which bent the front motor plate. That's what caused it to break, which is why they welded it. But of course, they never fixed the actual root cause of the problem, so it continued to bend and break again. And that's how it ended up in this situation where the valve cover is hitting this bar and the top of the engine is too far back. So unlike the other one where we can just make some adapters and add the torque converter and all that, we're going to have to pull this engine completely off and do some work on this engine mounting plate before we can do anything else. So with the engine removed, we can get a look at the damage now. From about here forward, I'd say, is bent up noticeably. We've got cracks all over the place up here. We've even got a number of cracks all throughout the plate. It's in pretty bad shape. I don't think it's worth fixing, so what I'm going to do is just cut it out and build a new mounting plate from scratch. So the engine mounting plate is all in. I ended up going with a little bit thicker metal than stock because the stock one actually felt a little bit flimsy once I got it out of there. So went with a little bit thicker metal for extra strength. It's also welded on both sides, so that'll give it some extra strength as well. So we shouldn't have any more problems with that. I did make the slots for the engine mounts longer so you get as far forward as possible. Unfortunately, that hasn't really helped the clearance issues. You see, we're still pretty close to that bar and still hardly any clearance under the muffler. So I guess when they built this at the factory, the frame was put together a little bit differently and the clearances are just tighter. So unfortunately, that's something we're just going to have to deal with. Now I'm going to put the torque converter on this one the same way I did the last one. We're going to lift it up about 1 inch and trim the backing plate just a little bit. Now because of that, I am going to have to remove this muffler before I lift it, since there clearly is not enough space to do so, but I was going to have to move the muffler anyway, so that's not too big of a deal. So to make the spacers, I'm going to be using this steel tube. We'll just cut it down to size, drill some holes with it in it, and that will create our spacers. So the spacers are in, the engine's now sitting about 1 inch higher. We just barely clear the edge of the air filter on this bar, but the cover won't clear at all. Took the muffler off, of course, because it wouldn't fit anymore. So now we're going to put the backing plate on, but before we do, we got to get this bolt out. Now this shield, most people when they put torque converters on, they pull this shield off because it gets in the way a bit. I don't like to do that because that shield is actually not there to protect other stuff. It's there to direct the airflow around the cylinder. So if you take that off, you interrupt the airflow and the engine might run a bit hotter. And I don't like that. So what I do is I just kind of bend it and smash it out of the way. So it fits pretty well. You can see here why I removed that bolt and bent the shroud. This boss needs to be able to clear, and it won't clear the bolt, and the shroud ends up hitting it. So we bend the shroud out of the way, pull the bolt out, and then it'll be able to sit flush. I am going to need to trim just a little bit off the bottom of this backing plate, but I think I'm actually going to end up trimming less than I did on the other mini bike, which is kind of nice. So let's get to it. It only took just a tiny amount of trimming. This is even less than the last backing plate, and it now sits on the engine exactly the way it's supposed to. So I need a new exhaust, and I happen to have this one, which I threw together for a 212 Duramax that didn't have one, and I actually have a video of that particular engine. But I managed to elongate the holes a bit so it fits. The only thing is it's going to be blowing exhaust onto the frame and fender. So I think I'll just weld a small diverter onto it so the exhaust will point out to the side a little bit more. So So it's a little bit close to the fender, but the actual exhaust is not going to be hitting the fender or the tire or the frame now, so I'm happy with it. If I decide to keep this long term, I might put some reflective tape on this fender or something just to keep her from cooking. So I could just zip tie this back in there, or buy a new GX200 gas tank to go on here. But where's the fun in that? I think that's much better. So this is a real fire extinguisher gas tank. It's a real fire extinguisher, drained all the chemicals out, cleaned it out, welded in a filler and a fitting for the fuel out, pulled off the handles because there wasn't enough clearance for them. So this will be our new gas tank. Now with the addition of that, it's just about ready. It's not plumbed in yet though. I actually have to take this tank back off because I need to paint the areas where I welded so that it doesn't rust. And I also need to paint the engine mount as well. But as soon as those are done, it'll be ready for another trail ride and it should do a lot better than it did the last time.